Hello, friends. Welcome to the Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is LTL Innovation, how NMFTA is building a better future with my friend Keith Peterson. How's it going, Keith?
Good. How are you doing today, Joe?
Doing great. This is an awesome topic. I'm looking forward to talking to you about it. Keith, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Keith Peterson. I'm the Director of Operations for NMFTA, which stands for the National Motor Freight Traffic Association. We represent the LTL carriers within the industry, but more than that, we're also a standard-setting organization. So if you think of classification, which is one of our main products and oldest products as well, it's really a standard that we set and we constantly make changes to as freight updates over the years. Beyond that, we also get into digital standards development. So you think standardizing APIs for the industry in order to lessen the friction across the logistics process. But also we have a cybersecurity arm as well, where we go out and set some standards and best practices for companies, for transportation companies to follow when it comes to cybersecurity.
Awesome. Again, one more time, it's National Motor Freight Traffic Association. I always say I forget the traffic part. Before we hit record, we were talking about the mission of NMFTA. And I always say, when you look at the percentage of money spent GDP-wise on transportation, we are much lower than most countries. So the United States, somewhere along the line, we got good at becoming very efficient. And I think a big part of that is LTL, because if you can't get the cost out of transportation, certain sales aren't feasible. And we've done that with ship containerized freight. We would not be getting our computers and our furniture from Asia if it was the old way. There was no way we were doing international, but it's the same with LTL. If I had to sell a product and I'm on the East Coast, I can't sell to the West Coast if I have to get a full truckload to move one or two pallets. So we've made a lot of business possible. And again, we've kept our cost of transportation really low relative to the rest of the world. So that part of that reason is LTL, and part of that reason is FTA.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you think of a large piece of machinery that maybe doesn't have to go across the nation, but just from New York to Tennessee, for instance, but it's not really a truckload, but it's the LTL carriers that manage to pick that freight up and get it down there to Tennessee in a safe manner, right? And you think about how much room that takes up on a trailer. What we do is try to help classify that freight in order to help carriers build rates and shippers to know how much it's going to cost. So that's really where classification originated.
I always like to cover the basics on this podcast. So I'm going to describe what LTL is to the best of my ability, and then I want to get your 2 cents on it. So if I have a full truckload of product and I'm going to ship it across the country, that's easy. I call a truckload and we fill that truck and we ship it from one coast to the other, and it's whatever it costs, $4,000 or $5,000. I'm not sure what the price is today. But if I say I only want to move one pallet from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I'll use Detroit because I'm in Detroit. I want to send a pallet from Detroit, and since you're in Minneapolis, I'm going to send it up to you in Minneapolis. I don't want to use a full truck. It seems like it's close on the map, but you're probably 10, 12 hours away from me. And in the olden days, pre-LTL, I would be saying, hey, I got to find somebody who's got a full truck that's going up there and see if I can't wedge one more pallet on. It was no market. And now we have a market. And so the way that LTL shipment works today is I would call one of the LTL companies and say, I have one pallet. It's got to go to Keith up in Minnesota. They would come pick it up, usually I think in the afternoon, and they would take it back to their terminal, and it would get on a line haul that would go somewhere. I'm guessing maybe to Chicago and then on to Minnesota. Might have to change trucks once or twice. But then there's another route driver who drives it to your location. So we have two route drivers. Those guys go home every night. And then we have the line hauls in the middle. Very different than truckload. It's A truckload, you load it once and yet you take it off once. LTL, though, gives me the opportunity to move fewer pallets. And again, we absolutely positively need it. So correct me where I went astray on that one, Keith.
No, high level, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you can go just one step down from there in that with truckload, really you're renting out a trailer. And I'm way oversimplifying it there, of
Yep.
course, Joe, right? But they're going to want to know the origin, the destination, and really how much weight is it, right? Just to make sure that they've got the right trailer and the right equipment for it. When somebody calls up an LTL company, they're going to want to know the origin and destination as well, but they're also going to want to know, okay, what's the dimensions of that freight, right? What's the length, the width, the height? What's the weight of it? How much room is it going to take up on my trailer? Beyond that, when it comes to the origin and destination, do they need a lift gate? How is it going to get loaded on exactly? And so there's going to be a lot more information that's going to be required as you set up an LTL shipment, but it's all goes into making sure that they can maximize the space on their trailer and be as efficient as possible when going around picking up all those pieces of freight and getting it back to their terminals. So, yeah.
Yep. Yep. And by the way, there's always a certain amount of people who go, oh, LTL does this, LTL does that. And I told you before we hit record, just before COVID, I was down in Laredo and I toured a number of less than truckload companies. Everyone would recognize their names. And I was shocked at how far they've come in the last 10 years. There used to be a lot more handling of LTL freight, but now it is, and I think it's a response from the shippers say, hey, we want less handling. Handling by definition, you could have damage. But there's a lot, I'm sure there's a stat somewhere, there's a lot less handling and transloading between LTL now than there was 10 years ago.
Yeah, it can definitely depend on the lane there as well. If you've got something that has to go quite a ways, they may have a partner or a different part of their organization where it is more of a line haul versus LTL, the more hub and spoke. So there's definitely a lot of ways. And of course, to your point, Joe, the less handling, the less chances you have of damage while in transit anyways.
And I can tell you, even when I was still doing less than truckload, which goes back well over 10 years ago, we would measure damage-free freight. And if you pack it, and again, that's a caveat, not everybody wants to pack their stuff right. There's very little damage on LTL freight. And I know I've talked to friends of mine who are in the truckload business who say, oh my God, there's so much damage. No, there just isn't. There might have been. And if you don't pack it right, and by the way, the LTL carriers will let you know if you aren't packing your stuff right. They do not like to see poor packaging.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Beyond classification and just naming item numbers and classes there, we actually, a good part of the book is part of packaging as well. We have one packaging manager that's really focused in on making sure that stays up to date. And in the individual items, you'll also see packaging notes about how it should be packaged on some of them that have some of those issues and stuff. So we take packaging very seriously. So really.
I have experienced with this where a company I knew was moving gun safes via LTL, and they were tall, and they wanted to ship them upright, and they kept falling and hitting other people's freight, and they got fired by the carriers. The carriers said, "No more. You're not shipping your freight with us anymore."
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, beyond, because a lot of people think of packaging as maybe being a box around it or a crate or something like that, but it'll go into how you strap it to a pallet in order to keep it from falling over at times. And we also have, we also work with companies as well that will test that type of stuff. Yeah, the amount of force that freight goes through in a trailer on a normal basis is pretty amazing once you really start digging into it. So,
yep. It is becoming more. It's always been an art and a science to load a truck, but I think we're seeing more and more. I'm not an expert in it, but I know people are getting very expert at packing trucks and to make sure they're filled to the gills and not too heavy.
it's funny you say that. My son actually works on a dock for an LTL carrier. And I was asking him about it one time, Joe, and he said, Dad, it's a lot like playing Tetris, honestly. So kind of, I have that image in my head, actually.
So, Keith, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined NMFTA.
Sure. The first part of my life, I actually lived in Washington State and then moved to Minnesota. And I bring that up because some of my earliest memories are actually of truck yards. My father was in the business, my grandfather was in the business, and my father would take me with him on trips. And so I still will be in a truck yard on a cool morning and smell diesel in the air. And it brings back a lot of good memories for me, actually. So that was in Washington, though. I moved to Minnesota and grew up really in Minnesota, and that's where I live today. When I was done with high school, I moved back to Washington and went to college and actually worked at a trucking company in Spokane, Washington. I started in the yard, tarping loads, moving coils around, cleaning out trucks at times. So all the time while I was...
You did it all.
Yep, all the time while I was going to school. And then once I was done with school, I worked for my dad, actually, and I said, hey, what's next? And he put me out on the road driving for a year. So I did over-the-road driving, mainly between California and Washington, but venturing out even as far as Florida at times for 1 year. And that was just a great experience for me, right? It taught me what it was like to be a truck driver, to make sure that I'm planning out my day appropriately in order to make sure I got there on time or know when I wasn't going to be able to make it. There were times I'd have to give up a load in order for a team, in order to make it in time. Hours of service, all that kind of stuff. Once I was done with that, I actually went into operations and dispatched planned fleets, working with drivers every single day, making sure that number one, loads got picked up and drivers got taken care of a lot of times. I worked in operations at a couple of companies and actually eventually went to work for Qualcomm in the year 2000, putting Qualcomm systems into... hadn't had them yet. Really, Qualcomm was going strong then. I worked there for 23 years and decided it was time for a change for me here. I worked with a lot of great companies while I was there and learned a lot about a lot of different types of businesses, whether it be trailers, truckload, LTL companies, really just the whole gamut of different companies that I was involved with while I was there. About 8 months ago, I started up with NMFTA. When I talked to them, it just sounded like a really exciting position to get involved with and start really turbocharging this classification reimagination here and working with the team there in order to get really get it going and putting it into action. It's something that they've been doing for a while, consolidating some of the items, making them full density, but what we're leading up to is really a pretty big change all at once here. And we're making sure that we're working not just with carriers, but also shippers and 3PLs to make that change happen and get everybody up to date on what is going to be happening, because it's going to affect a lot of different people.
I love it. There's normally a big gap where there's people who say, we own trucks, and that electronics company or that brokerage or that association, they don't know what it's like. They've never touched a truck. They've never driven a truck. You are one of the few executives I've bumped into who can say, yep, I've done that. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to live the life of a trucker. And I always tell people I did it one day. It wasn't a big rig. It was a 6-wheel truck. I flew to Chicago and I had to drive home. It's normally 4 hours, but it snowed like hell that day. I shouldn't have been driving. And I remember every time I would call to say, hey, I'm going to be late because of the snow, this guy yelled at me. And I was like, oh my God, it's not my fault. It snowed like crazy. I shouldn't even be driving. But they're like, you better hurry up. And I was thinking the wrong message to give it to a young driver. But God almighty, what a hard day that was. It took, instead of 4.5 hours from Chicago to Detroit, normally it was like 8.5 hours. Oh, I was like, whoo. Not easy work.
Yeah, no, I remember there were days I'd have to chain up going over mountain passes. And I try to explain what that's like to people. And it's hard work. It really is. So that or unloading a trailer.
You're driving an avalanche.
Yeah. But it was a great experience for me. And provided me even to this day. A lot of things that I always think of as I'm working through some of this
You've
stuff.
been in
So
that seat.
yeah.
So when we talk about less than truckload, we have classifications. And I give the caveat, everybody who's listening, everybody who's working at NMFTA, all the LTL carriers, none of us invented the LTL classification system. I think that, does it go back to as far as the 40s or even earlier?
Probably even earlier. It actually started with the railroad, honestly. And I'm not prepared for a test here, Joe, but
It's a
but
long
yeah,
time ago.
yeah, it was a long time ago. So it's been around a long time. You're correct here.
So I think one of the challenges we've all had, any of us who've worked in LTL, is these classifications were often around product. So it was like, hey, if you want to move chairs, I'm going to make these things up because I don't remember. You're going to move chairs, that's class 65. And then you would say, hey, it's class 65, it weighs this much. And then it would get divided to class 75 because it had metal or wooden legs and we thought they were metal. And you're like, it just felt very arbitrary. And it was the system that just developed over time. I think lots of improvements, but it didn't feel like it. So anytime anybody was reclassified, it was often a reclassification fee in addition. And it was maddening. And I could tell you, I worked at a less than truckload company. When we would have a reclassification, our customer was paying more. And a lot of times they didn't want to pay more. They felt like it was our fault and we should pay that. So it caused a lot of challenges. So you get really quick on the same page with the LTL companies. What are you going to classify this as? And again, they didn't invent it. I didn't invent it. You guys didn't invent it. We're all trying to fix it now. So it is easier to use, more user-friendly. And that's what we're talking. So when you mentioned, say earlier, classifications reimagined, that's what you're talking about. So with that introduction, let's talk about this classifications reimagined. What is that?
Sure. So classification reimagined is something that we've been doing for a while here at NMFTA. And really the objectives of Reimagine for us is really overall to simplify the NMFC. So we want to increase freight classification accuracy on the first try, make that classification user experience a lot better for people. And it's really leading up to reducing the friction between shippers, carriers, 3PLs, really across the entire logistics process for people here. So a lot of what you described there is that friction that ends up happening, right? I always refer to it, let me put it this way. In my mind, I always think of somebody at a shipper that's got something that needs to be put on a truck, and they've got a sticky note on the side of their monitor. And that's what they've been told is the item number and class of what they need to ship. Now, the great and beautiful thing about classification at NMFTA is that it can be changed and it's always going to be updated because product is always updating. But that sticker could be 10 years old, that sticky note, right? In fact, it's up there with a piece of tape now because the sticky is worn out on the back of it here. And that's what they put in there. And that's where those reclassifications come from. So we want to make it easier for everybody across the board to find the right item number and the right class for their freight in order to make it just a lot less frustrating to get through this here.
Yep. And you mentioned the classifications. You said, I think, NMFC. So what does that stand for?
National Motor Freight Classification System. That's what it stands for.
So when somebody says, what is the NMFC for that product, it ranges, what is it, from like 55? Is that the lowest?
50 is the lowest. It's actually an 18-point scale.
50 to what's the highest classification?
Ooh,
I thought it was 300 or something. I don't know.
I want to say it's in the 400s. I'd have to double check.
400? Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
if it's in the 50s, it's less expensive, meaning it is usually denser. And if it's in the 400s, it's going to be lighter and bigger. So before we hit record, when we were prepping, I mentioned it is cheaper to move bricks than pillows. And you look and say, yeah, but it's 3 pallets of bricks, 3 pallets of of pillows, why would the bricks cost less? It's a little counterintuitive because we go, wouldn't you rather personally move the pillows and the bricks? But that's not the way that it works. And I'm going to trust the LTL carriers. I know what they want. They say we want density. So they want to move heavier stuff. So the 400 would be the pillows and the 5 or the 50 would be the bricks.
Weight is a big concern of it, right? But there's also what size is the freight as well. But yeah, you're right. Bricks are very dense freight. You can almost call it desirable freight, right? It's small, it's compact, it fits into the size of a pallet very easily, and it's ready to go. It can be hard to damage. Of course, you can damage anything. It's safe freight, basically.
So when you guys are reimagining these classifications, how are you reimagining them? What are you doing to make it easier on the shippers, carriers, brokers, and 3PLs?
So historically, we've always evaluated commodities on 4 main characteristics and packaging. Those 4 characteristics are density, handling, stowability, and liability. So as you look at a piece of freight, we've discussed density already and the importance of that, but there's also handling, stowability, liability, right? How much room does it take up? Does it take up half the trailer? But it could be really light, but it takes up a bunch of a trailer. Doesn't fit normally on a pallet. So what we're trying to do is standardize the evaluation of all these commodities when density is the primary transportation characteristic. So what that means is we're going to be looking at products that have no handling, stowability, and liability issues, right? We're setting those aside. Those are already well researched and documented. And those commodities, we know that they have handling, stowability, and liability issues. They have classes appropriately that have been researched. So we're leaving those alone, honestly, to start with. Okay. And we're going to take these other items that don't have any of those characteristics and make density the primary characteristic of them by going to a full density scale. And that's something that could affect over 3,000 different items, basically, as we look at it in the book. So it's a process that we've started going through already in preparation for the first docket in 2025. So we actually have given ourselves about a year to get through this process and look at each one of those items one by one and determine, are they affected by our plan? And the final list of those items will be out in 2025-1.
Yep. And so your goal, and it's the whole industry's goal, is how do we simplify this? How do we make it easier for everybody for me as a shipper to say, I believe it's this classification, and you as the carrier say, yep, you got it, Joe. And the 3PL, if they're involved, says, yep, that was easy.
Yeah.
That was easy. What we're trying to avoid is the wrong classification, which we've all been involved with, anyone who's done LTL. And it's very frustrating because I thought I was shipping it for this much money because I picked a very low classification, and then it gets reclassified and I get hit with an extra cost. Usually there's a reclassification cost plus the extra cost of moving up a classification or two. And some companies this is a decade old, what I'm talking about, would send their stuff for years on class 55 or 65 when it probably should have been 85, and no one caught it. And then when it got caught that this was being shipped for too cheap, there was just a lot of anger. And again, anytime there's a cost that you didn't expect, there's upset. And if you're the 3PL involved in that, and again, I have your customer is blaming you, like, why did this happen to me? And you would say, who knows why? And what you're trying to do over at NMFTA is say, let's try and avoid that kind of thing.
Exactly. And make it on the actual dimensions that this freight is. So and one thing I want to say is that, because you're talking about changes, right? And these are going to be some pretty substantial changes for not just carriers, but also shippers and 3PLs. So we are going to be having some listening sessions where we're going to go through in more detail what our strategy is for 2025-1 and get into more detail on exactly how that's going to be rolled out here. And then at the end of that, we'll be sending out an email to get feedback, regarding what you think of our strategy. So it's really important that people take part in these listening sessions and we get this feedback as we continue building out this docket release 2025-1, which will be released in January of 2025. So it's a huge project that we're undertaking, but we think it's very much necessary and important for the industry in order to get us to where we're more frictionless throughout the process.
Yeah, when you say listening, you guys are the ones listening. You're asking the questions. Guys, tell us what you want, what you don't want. And we talked about this before we hit the record button is we had the ELD mandate and they were asking about, I think it got pushed back a few times, but the ELD mandate, the government was asking, please help us, give us your feedback. And everyone's busy. Everyone's way too busy to give their feedback. But then when it hit, there was a lot of upset. Oh, wow. Like it hit us out of nowhere. We saw it coming for a long time. And we had the same with the Food Safety Modernization Act. It impacted anyone who moves certain kinds of food, produce, fresh meats. And all of a sudden, FDA had some purview over our trucking business. And I remember they asked for a long time, give us your feedback. And I was involved before it became an act. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed, and they did not get as much feedback as they would have liked. So you guys are not the government. You're you're an organization, an industry organization. If you don't give them feedback now, don't bitch later.
Well, to your point, everybody is busy, but this is a very important undertaking, and yeah, it can be hard to get feedback at times, but I don't think we're going to have much issue with that. Honestly, Joe, we've had to open up extra sessions because we've had so many people sign up for these sessions, and it'll be listening on both sides. They'll have to listen to me and Nate, Ripke, and Joe Orr for a bit, other people at NMFTA, but then we'll listen back, really. We're making it a point to be as transparent as possible with what we're doing. These changes are going to be big for, like I said, not just the carriers, but for the shippers and the 3PLs as well, affecting systems that have been in place for a long time. So that's part of the reason why we're being so open about this so early. We don't usually talk about what's going to be on a docket or a strategy for it this early, but we felt it was important to get people thinking about it and planning for it well ahead of time here.
Is there a technology aspect to this change?
There sure is. One of our products at NMFTA is really, I'm going to call it Class It. It's either Class IT or Class It, depending on how you pronounce it. I've heard it both ways out there in the industry. And as well as rolling out reimagination on docket 2025-1, we're also going to be doing a large update to Class IT as it comes out here. We want to make it much more powerful from a search functionality and usability for people in order to make it a lot easier for them to really find classification on the first try, as well as just update the functionality of it, right? Save favorites, either for yourself or for your company. Put extra info in there about possibly the last time an interpretation was done on this item, for instance, or other things as well, in order to make it much more powerful for people. At the same time, adding capabilities like API capabilities for people to use with their systems in order to use classification numbers and our data that we have in there and more closely integrate it with their systems as well. So there's going to be some large changes coming for Class IT as well.
So when I'm thinking of a transportation management system, I can search within there to see what my product classification is. So let's just say I'm moving some apparel and I say, okay, this is 2 pallets of sweaters that I want to move. I should be able to go in there and say, just type in sweaters and then pick a classification from there?
If you think about it, it'd be a lot like a search functionality. So you have sweaters, right? And eventually that it could be the first iteration of our updates is it gives you a list, much like Google today, right? Or one of the search functions here. It gives you a list and it helps you get to where the closest part here. So something like sweaters will likely be in clothing, a generic heading, right? And it should be pretty easy to find. And then what we'd like to do is even take it to the next step is, hey, what's your density on this? And provide you with a class right away. Right now, we do have a density calculator, so you can put it in, but you still have to go find the class accordingly from what you get from it. Just really take some of those steps out and get you to that class, that item number and class that much quicker and easier.
I like it. I like it. Now, there used to be this thing that we would do in Less Than Truckload until I want to get your 2 cents on it. So it was, I think it was called FAK, Freight All Kinds. And I think it was when you had a whole bunch of different parts being shipped out, different products, I should say. And you would just say, hey guys, rather than mess around with this, just call all of this class 75. Now, is that still go on? And how does that play into what we're talking about today?
Sure, carriers still do use FAKs, really. And if you think about it, it's really making density the primary characteristic, which is where we're headed here. Now, we're not going to do away with item numbers. We still believe that you need to know what's on your trailer back there in some way, but you will see the number of item numbers condense as a result of our reimagination, right? So if you think of a generic heading, we could condense that down and just put a lot of the descriptors in that generic heading instead of individual item numbers and make it full density. So you're going to see some of that. In a sense, we're not going to call it at NMFTA freight all kinds. We still believe that you do need to have item numbers, although it could be all be packed together, medical goods or clothing or something like that. A lot of different types of clothing, but it's all on a pallet stacked up, right? A lot of us, I should say, have been on a dock and you see a pallet stacked high with several different products, right? But we'll make density that primary characteristic on it. And that's really where freight all kinds is going.
Yep. So we touched on the technology of this, but before we hit record, we're talking about this idea of digitalization. Please elaborate.
Yeah, so another part of NMFTA, and if you think of NMFTA beyond classification, and really including classification, I should say, we're a standard setting organization. Classification is really just setting standards for people, right? We've moved beyond that into really a digital standards setting council. We've started with an LTL council where the council decides on which APIs to create standards on. And what that does is gives everybody a level playing field on how you should really set up this API to be transmitted across the entire process. We've already introduced eBOL of lading and have had really good participation in that and adoption of that. So if you think of somebody like C.H. Robinson, they're sending out thousands of eBOL of ladings a day using that API standard. And what we've done is we've pulled together carriers, 3PLs, a shipper partners, TMS partners, really together on a council in order to make these decisions on which ones we're going to create a standard on. And then we actually create a technical guide for them where we actually build the API and we make it open source so anybody can go and get it. We're not charging for it. It's really for the industry. It's a standard setting so that everybody can be on the same level when it comes to that here. So eBOL lading was our first one. Next one, we're getting into some in-transit visibility and different guides there as we continue throughout this here. So sorry, pickup visibility is next, then in-transit visibility as well here.
Yep. So when you talk about the bill of lading, BOL, that's always been paper. And I think we saw a big challenge with that during COVID, but it's also not easy because it's a piece of paper and any piece of paper eventually has to become digital again anyway. We all know that. And how does that work into this e-bill or electronic bill of lading? How does that work into the proof of delivery for these shipments?
The goal of it is really so that right from the start of a shipment, the e-bill lading gets transmitted through API to the carrier, to the 3PL, and on from there. And it's got all the information that you need. And really going around, if you think of imaging software, where it would You can scan it and it gets some of the image, some of the information into there. It's having it all available right away. So the bill of lading, the length, width, height, the weight, in order to get the density, item number, all those important pieces of information being filled into this e-bill lading already and just getting transmitted out to where it needs to go and being able to be consumed effectively as well into a TMS by the carrier, however it may be. So it's really part of, as I said before, that frictionless process we're trying to create across logistics.
Yep. Absolutely necessary. We should also mention when we think about trucking, we think about truckload. I think the largest truckload company has 1.5% of the market. LTL is a little different. It's a smaller market. And I think, correct me if I've gone astray, I think the top 9 or 10 companies have 85% of the 80% of the volume. And I think the top 25 have 90 some percent of the volume. So it is not a ton of players, but they can't be a monopoly. So you need an organization like you guys to say, hey, guys, we're going to create some standards that we all agree to. So you're working not only with those top 25, which has most of the volume, but you're also working with all the smaller LTL companies that might only have a few trucks and deliver to maybe a metropolitan area.
Yeah, absolutely. We have carriers of all sizes as part of the NMFTA. We think it's important that they all get representation and are part of the association. So as well here. So yeah.
Yep. So it is. I will say, when I was doing Less Than Truckload, there aren't a ton of national players. And I've asked when I've had the private equity guys on in the past or venture capital guys on, I would always say, why aren't there more LTL carriers? And they always say it is an extremely difficult business. And it takes first, if you have to have freight in an area to make it happen. And we've seen some, I won't mention them, but very high profile failures in the LTL space because it is such a difficult business. I touched on how difficult it is sometimes, the little squabbles that we might have as shippers or 3PLs or carriers. But the carriers, it is an extremely difficult business. Truckload's hard. I think LTL is even harder because you have to have terminals. And it means you open a terminal in Boise, Idaho, you have to have the volume there. And that's a kind of a chicken or the egg kind of thing when you think about it.
Exactly. And not just the terminal, but the equipment that goes along with the terminal as well. So you've got the terminal, the equipment, the people that need to work there as well. And it can be a lot, logistically speaking, to get a terminal up and running and get the freight in there and get it through there. But it is part of the life cycle of an LTL company and of a freight shipment to get through these terminals. What's funny is, as well as also as you look around with LTL companies, you see a lot of them partner up in order to move freight from one zone to another or even across the country when it's needed. Or you may see a bit of some of the truckload companies working closely with LTL companies or having part of their organization that is LTL and being able to really work together to make that shipment process more efficient. I think you were talking about from Laredo up to Minneapolis before we started recording, and just taking one trailer and getting all that freight up there for a larger manufacturer, right? That's more of an over the road, but started by LTL there basically. Some of those lines can get blurred at times, either within the organization or through processes, but I did want to make a point when it comes, pull it back to e-bill lading. That is one of the major things as well that I probably didn't mention. That's a big positive of e-bill lading is across the different partners. So if you're moving it across the country and it has to go through a couple of different companies, LTL companies, that e-bill lading, if it's adopted by everybody, that can just continue to move throughout the process there as well. And that's where in-transit visibility comes in as well, which is a coming API for us. So, yeah.
Yep. I was in Laredo just before COVID. Boy, it was the good old days before COVID.
Yeah.
And it was summertime in Laredo, best time to visit. And while I was down there, I toured a number of LTL facilities. And I was working with a company that was shipping up into Minnesota and also into the Northeast. So a long haul. And I was asking, if we're shipping an LTL shipment, how many stops between Laredo and outside of Minneapolis? And what I expected was, oh, it's going to go to St. Louis and it's going to switch. It's going to go and get put on a different truck, and it's going to go to St. Louis to Chicago, then get on another truck, and then that will go to Minneapolis. And the guy said, and this was very surprising to me, but it shows how quickly the industry has adapted. They said, we're going to put this in a pup, which is a smaller, I don't know, 20-foot truck, whatever it is, trailer, I'm sorry. And this will not get unloaded until Minneapolis. And that kind of addresses a lot of the kind of almost stereotypical complaints you would hear about Less Than Truckload is, oh, it's going to go to St. Louis and it's going to get unloaded and it could get broken because you're moving it. Anytime you're touching it, there's a chance that something goes wrong, that you don't put it in the truck, and not all three pallets didn't come together. But they're addressing that. And I was surprised. Now, we asked a few different scenarios, and the guy did say, Joe, 10 years ago, that would have made multiple stops on the way to Minneapolis. He says, but we're getting better and better at that. And the technologies we're using is making it a lot easier for them to do that. And less handling means less hassle, less cost. It's a much better solution. And let's face it, we all need it. The solutions that we're asking for are world-class. And by the way, when we think about same day, next day, that means we're going to have the inventory close to consumers. A lot more LTL involved in that. So it's going to be a pallet or two. It's not going to be a full truckload unless it's something that sells quite a bit. So LTL is here to stay, and actually we need it even more when we talk about same day, next day shipments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I also wanted to talk to you about cybersecurity. It has been on my mind a lot. I told you this when we were prepping, that I'm not hoping for this, but I worry that we're going to have a cyber 9/11, which is that horrible wake-up call. We have freight fraud. We're addressing that, but that is not that's a truckload missing. Cybersecurity is a big concern because we do know that there's bad actors in the world. They could be state actors. They could be just hackers who are trying to hack our systems. And we are working with a lot of small trucking companies, small shippers. And what we need to do is we somehow have to keep our act together when we're connecting a whole bunch of people we don't always know very well. So we need leadership from you guys to help us from stepping in it. So please elaborate.
Yeah, as I said before, I mean, we're a standard setting organization at NMFTA, and a different arm that we have as well working with us is really our cybersecurity part as well. If you think about it, I think I heard the number 70% of our goods really, at least at one point, are touched by truck, and either getting to the store or to a distribution center or what have you. And that makes our transportation companies, our whole sector, very important to us in the United States here. In that, hey, if we're hit hard, yeah, I'm joking. You joked about COVID before. All of a sudden, they're out of toilet paper at Costco, right? And of course, I'm joking. But
it was a bad time, we know.
yeah, that makes cybersecurity really important. And what we're doing is pulling together a lot of the experts in, whether it be at carriers, in the technology field, and creating best practices and guides in order to keep our members and really the industry as safe as possible from cyber attacks here. So we have a conference coming up at the end of October in Cleveland where we're going to have people in the technology space, people from carriers, all speaking at this conference about what they do and their best practices. So it's a really good learning experience for people within the industry to take advantage of here.
Yeah, and we're talking today on the 23rd of July. A few weeks ago, we had the AT&T hack, and scary, very scary. And then last week we had the CrowdStrike. That was an oversight or whatever it was, but it talks about Both of those are major companies. It shut down a lot of airlines for a few days, and they're still screwed up a week later. And that just speaks to the vulnerability and also our dependence on the technology being right. And this is my opinion right now. I feel like if you're working with the Fortune 1000 and the Fortune 2000, they're going to start asking, what are you doing to make sure that we don't have a cybersecurity threat? And most of us are not cybersecurity experts. We're in the transportation, logistics, supply chain business or a technology business, but we all have to concern ourselves because our customers are going to ask. If we were talking 3-4 years ago, I'd say, yeah, your customer is definitely going to ask at some point about sustainability. I still think that's true, but I think cybersecurity is top of mind right now.
Yeah, and one thing we're concentrating on is not just the large companies that maybe have a staff or people that are able to determine their strategy and make sure it's carried out, but what do some of the smaller companies do as well that maybe don't have that staff to do that, right? Who do they work with in order to do maybe some penetration testing every once in a while, which is a very common practice, right? Yeah. And what are your best practices there in order to help keep you safe? There's a lot of education out there, but trying to pull it all together to put a plan in place for maybe a smaller carrier in order to help them with that here, as well as here's what you do if you have been attacked or hacked, basically. Yeah.
I talked to a lot of trucking companies, and I can tell you some of them have been in the press, but there's been some cybersecurity hacks. And again, you think you're doing it right. AT&T is obviously a technology company. They got hacked a few weeks ago. The CrowdStrike thing impacted Microsoft. So if Microsoft can be impacted, the airlines can be impacted. Surely we can too. So it's one of those things. It's scary. And I've talked to cybersecurity people before, and they'll say, Joe, if they wanted to hack you, they would. and that's how scary this is. So I'm not just saying that to scare them to your conference, but it's probably not. Now, I'm assuming if you can't make it to Cleveland in the 27th through the 29th of October, you guys still have resources that you can help them with?
Yep, we sure do. It's all on nmfta.org. And you're able to go in there and see what we're doing in regards to cybersecurity, as well as any kind of discussions or interviews that we're doing there as well here. Yep, we have plenty of resources available for.
And this is for shippers, carriers, 3PLs, and brokers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody that's interested. Yep.
So I'll make sure I put a link to that conference in the show notes. I will also put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your website, and any of the links you and your marketing team give me, but we'll for sure put that one in there. Last but not least, so when are these LTL listening sessions? Do you have dates?
Yeah, for classification reimagined, the listening sessions we're going to be having, the LTL listening sessions are on August 6th, 7th, and 8th. And we've got one day set aside for carriers, one day set aside for shippers, one day set aside for 3PLs. Now, we've had to actually add on some sessions about a half an hour apart. So it's going to be a couple of busy days for us there because we had so much response and so many people signing up for these listening sessions. So get on there and sign up for what's most appropriate for you. We've had a lot of cross-pollination. I do see 3PLs on the carriers. I think a lot of times it just has to do with their schedules, but we're looking forward to these. It's going to be a listening, not just for you guys to listen to us, but also for us to listen to you. And it can be tough to provide feedback on a large call like that, but we will be sending out surveys afterwards in order to gather that feedback. You had mentioned ELD before, and we're running it really the same way in that we're taking feedback and we're interested in what people think and how they're going to prepare for these type of things. So we will be taking that feedback and making adjustments as needed according to what we can do. We do have a strategy we have to carry out, a plan that we have to make sure we get through. But I always like to remind people, Joe, as well, is that the beauty of the classification system is that it can be changed. And we change it 3 times a year currently. Even if something needs to be changed going forward, much like ELD hey, let's go in there and let's do what's right and let's change it as it needs to be. So it's an ongoing process. So,
You were part of the ELD business when that hit. So do you remember people acting completely shocked, like they never once heard the term on I had no idea. What is this ELD? And it was in
yeah.
the news for a long time. But it just goes to show you we're busy. We're moving freight. We're doing stuff. We're not everybody's job. That is the government. The government that's a FedReg. They were open and they wanted feedback. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say NMFTA, this is our organization. You guys are working on our behalf. So there is no coming down from on high. This is, you want everyone's feedback so we can make this the very best system for our industry. Will you record these sessions? So if somebody can't make it, can they still participate in some way?
You know what? We likely will record the sessions. We'll have to determine the best way to release them out after that here, but I'm sure we will be recording them and then we'll have to decide exactly how we want to use them after that here.
Awesome. Awesome. So I am going to summarize the best I can. Then I want to get your final thoughts on this topic, Keith. So I'm talking to my friend Keith Peterson. We're talking about LTL innovation, how NMFTA is building a better future for us. So we talked about what NMFTA is, which is a standard setting organization. And what the whole goal here is less friction. And that's less friction between LTL carriers, the shippers, the brokers, and the 3PLs, everyone who has to live with this system. We want it to be the very best. And none of us invented this. This was invented a long time ago. We're the ones who are left to fix it. And it has gotten way better, but it's going to get even better with these changes. So we talked about the classifications, reimagined. Hopefully there's fewer. And this is going to lead to a whole bunch of technology innovations that we can only do when we get the NMFCs together and in fewer of them. Next, we talked about digitalization and the LTL Council. And is it the Digitalization LTL Council? Is that what it is? It's a group?
It really is. Yeah, it's a group that meets really once a month and reviews where we are in current APIs and decides what we're going to do next. And I'll probably just add in there that we're going to be growing the number of these councils to go out into other parts of the industry as well. So if you think like truckload and that type of stuff, right, which is just different enough to require us to probably look at a different council for that here.
I
So
like it.
pretty exciting times ahead on that.
So developing some standard APIs, the visibility APIs too. And then we talked about cybersecurity. So you guys have a cybersecurity conference. I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. That's October 27th through the 29th in Cleveland. Driving distance for many of us. And then last but not least, we talked about the LTL listening sessions. You guys are looking to educate us, but you're also looking for feedback on how we can make this better. Those listening sessions are August 6th, 7th, and 8th. One for carriers, one for brokers and 3PLs, and one for shippers. What I'll do is I'll put a link to that so people can sign up for that also. Final thoughts on this topic, Keith Peterson.
Really just wanted to thank you, Joe, for having me on here to go through what we're doing in NMFTA and all the exciting things we have going on here. It's a time of change for us here, and we're all really excited about it here. And looking forward to making this entire process, we say friction free here, but being able to get the class, the item number, the class of the item on the first try, or even making that a digital process as well, is something that we're really looking forward to and we're really excited about. We'll continue to be transparent and be very open with where we're headed, because we know that these changes are large for a lot of us here. So we have to give people a chance to plan and prepare for these changes as we move forward here.
It was my pleasure talking to Keith, and I love what you guys are doing. And again, I think there's a tendency, I know I've done it. I was an LTL 3PL, and we would curse these problems, but I never participated in the solution. We're being asked, guys, do you want to participate in creating something better, or do you want to curse the darkness? And this is a great opportunity. Again, this is not the government saying you have to do this. This is our organization. So how do we join NMFTA? Can I also put a link to that in the show notes?
So, yeah, just go to nmfta.org. Now, it is an LTL carrier association, right? We do have several different products out there, Class IT, that anybody can purchase and other things going on. So, right there on nmfta.org, you can learn how you can get involved and participate.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time, Keith.
Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate your time today.
And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support is very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.